Good evening, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer. I'm a research fellow at St Edmunds College at the University of Cambridge, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back to this inaugural meeting of the New Look Cambridge seminar on the future of the island of Ireland. We're thrilled to be joined by someone who needs little introduction to anyone who follows politics and society in the island of Ireland, Sam McBride. And Sam is going to speak to us on the topic of Keir Starmer, Irish Unity's nemesis. Sam McBride is the Northern Ireland editor at the Belfast Telegraph and the Sunday Independent. He also writes about Northern Ireland for The Economist and was previously political editor at the Belfast newsletter. His 2019 book, Burned, the inside story of the Cash for Ash scandal and Northern Ireland's secretive new elite, became a Sunday Times and Irish Times bestseller and was nominated for the Christopher Ewart Biggs Memorial Prize. It's also a great read for anyone who hasn't looked at it. He's a regular presence on radio and television, giving analyses of events that impact Northern Irish politics. Sam, thanks a million for being with us. Sam is going to be in conversation with our own Professor Mike Kenny. Mike Kenny is the inaugural director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. He previously worked at Queen's University Belfast between 1990 and 1993, as well as at the University of Sheffield and Queen Mary University of London. Currently, Professor Kenny is working on a book on the constitutional futures of the United Kingdom. So I believe this is a very interesting pairing, and I look forward to hearing. First of all, Sam is going to make opening remarks for 10-15 minutes. Then himself and Mike are going to have a conversation. And then, as always, we'll allow 30 minutes at the end for questions and answers with you, our audience. Final word from me, please feel free to include or to make full use of the questions and answers function here on Zoom, to which you should be all familiar. And with that, I leave it over to Sam. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you, Barry. Can I just check that everyone's able to hear me okay? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all for your interest in this. Keir Starmer has been Labour leader for about 2.5 years, but for much of that time, there have either been questions about whether he would survive or about whether his party was seriously likely to win the next general election. And the last few weeks have transformed that situation in a remarkably short space of time. He is now overwhelmingly likely to be the next Prime Minister who is really able to push through his programme with a serious majority. Whatever Rishi Sunak may want to do in power in relation to Northern Ireland, he does not have either the mandate or the majority which are likely to see his ideas enacted in areas where they might be controversial. And Starmer's programme, such as we know it, and it's in pretty scant form right now, will have profound consequences for Ireland, yet it has received pretty limited serious scrutiny until this point. I think in part because there has been so much going on in politics in general with this current government. The world has been a very busy place for the last couple of years. We've had a pandemic, we've had Brexit, we've had all manner of very dramatic crises in Westminster. And that has strained the bandwidth, I suppose, of the sorts of people who might be poring over what is being said about Northern Ireland and perhaps asking more questions about it than have been asked over recent years. And I think that the prospect of him coming to power, if indeed that is what happens, means that he will inherit a union which is far more fragile, both economically and constitutionally, than it has been at any time in my lifetime, and arguably for going much further back than I can either remember or have lived through. And if you look at a chart, as I was doing at the end of last week, of the polling on Starmer, they really look as though there has been some sort of computer malfunction, that what has happened over the last few weeks is just so dramatic that it has to be an error. For 2 years, as an example of this, YouGov has been tracking the British public's view on Starmer. And for most of that time, he didn't really impress the public. He didn't look like a serious figure. A year ago, just 18% of people said that he looked like a prime minister in waiting. And that figure was pretty much unchanged until this month, when it doubled to almost 40%. And when you look at that chart, there are two lines going across like this. They're very far apart. One is saying that he's not very impressive. One is saying that he is impressive. And then suddenly they just go together and merge in the space of a very few weeks. And I think that if you look at some of the other polling around this, there are obviously lots of ways of testing the public mood on these things. They largely tell a very similar and a very dramatic story. On party voting intention, the Politico poll of polls has Labour on about 52% at the moment, with the Tories on 23%. That's a gargantuan gulf, and the sort of gulf which in any normal circumstance would just be unrecoverable in the space that is available to the Conservative Party. And the fact that over coming months, if that is how long this government lasts, or over the next couple of years, if they manage to go that distance, that this Tory government is going to face increasingly unpopular but unavoidable decisions means that there is significant reason to believe that that might perhaps recover to an extent. I think that's likely. Liz Truss has been a particularly unpopular Prime Minister, but it's so far off that I think Starmer is now very likely not just to win the next election, but to win it by a landslide. And governments tend to lose elections rather than oppositions winning them. And I think that's particularly true in this instance. Keir Starmer is not somebody who tends to excite great passion, either among his supporters or among the wider population, or, dare I say it, among journalists. But his sort of image of competent monotony, of dullness, but sort of getting on with things and getting them done is, I think, perfectly matched to the mood of the moment here. People have had enough of chaos. They've had enough of radical big ideas and people who are going in to break the system. I think by the time we get to the next general, general election, or if that comes suddenly, there is likely to be a mood of a deep desire for stability, for competence, for somebody who's going to make politics boring again, and somebody who is not going to wallow in the sorts of things that have become commonplace over recent months. And I think that one of the curious things about Starmer is that in many ways, while being a leader of the Labour Party, he has been a very conservative leader, a very small c conservative leader. His most radical move really as Labour leader has been to expel his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, and his default position on most things is really plodding caution, albeit consciously disrupted here and there by several high-profile left-wing projects. And after the Queen's death, we saw a glimpse of this as regards his view of the constitutional question. Starmer's tribute in the Commons to Her Majesty was as heartfelt as any of those from the Tory benches. But he went on to reveal something about his own vision of the Union, saying of the late Queen, "The country she came to symbolise is bigger than any one individual or any one institution. It is the sum total of all our history and all our endeavours, and it will endure." Now, you might write those off as simply the words of someone who is trying to find the right words for a very significant national moment, for a moment where people are feeling particularly patriotic, where they're feeling a degree of uncertainty about what might come next. But I think that there are other aspects of what Starmer has said and what he has done and what he has not done, which point towards those actually symbolising something quite significant in his view of the UK as a country, the Union as an entity, and there is something in that, I think, which could potentially be very significant for how he approaches Irish affairs. Having said all that, Starmer is clearly not a Tory, and I'm not trying to in any way suggest that is the case, but he represents what are essentially many conservative values, the most basic of which is the maintenance of the Union itself. The idea that this country is something that he likes, that he wants to keep. Yes, he wants to change it in certain ways. He wants to change it economically. He wants to change it to a certain extent socially, but actually he doesn't want to break it up. And therein lies a dilemma, I think, for Irish nationalism. Irish nationalism tends to hate the Tories, and especially these Tories, but the Labour government on offer here is likely to make Irish unity, I think, more remote based on what we now know. Irish nationalism's instinctive affinity has always been with Labour. The SDLP take the Labour whip. Sinn Féin venomously denounce the Tories almost no matter what they do, but with a great degree of force given what has happened recently. And the Northern nationalist parties in Ireland are really clearly left of centre. Certainly that's how they define themselves. And so there is a natural affinity there towards the Labour Party. And yet when you look at Irish history, Labour has often disappointed Republicans in particular. Two of the Secretaries of State they have most loathed, Roy Mason and Peter Mandelson, were Labour. And similarly, the Tory party, while promising much and while in strict rhetorical terms being much closer to unionism and calling itself the unionist party and a party which the Northern Ireland Unionists took their whip in Westminster for many decades, in the early decades of Northern Ireland, in many ways, it has disappointed unionism again and again, from Thatcher, as was not even known by unionism at that time in the early 80s, authorising very secret talks with the IRA leadership at a point where she was ruling that out, and they were pleased that she was ruling that out, to her then openly signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement, something which really dismayed and really incensed unionism across the board in Northern Ireland. There has been a very significant history right up until the present day and until Boris Johnson and the Irish Sea border of a sense of betrayal between unionism and the Tory party, certainly as it has been perceived on this side of the Irish Sea. And while Tony Blair brought Sinn Féin into power sharing and was very significant in a way that lots of lots of unionists did not appreciate in 1998 at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, it was not entirely one-way traffic. He conclusively ruled out at that point what until that point Sinn Féin had been demanding, that was that the British government should become persuaders for Irish unity. That is effectively putting pressure on unionists to try to usher them out of the union. What Tony Blair did was, yes, very painful for unionists. It was something that most of them didn't welcome, even if they went along with it. But actually, it was not in any way giving Irish nationalism or certainly giving Sinn Féin what it actually really wanted at that point. And Starmer has adopted an even more explicitly pro-union stance than Blair. That's perhaps because the union is more obviously in peril at this point, but he has said that a Labour government would not be neutral on the union in a border poll, that it would campaign for Northern Ireland to stay in the union. Something that we can explore is how significant that would be if it was to happen, because some people think that actually that would be counterproductive, but that's almost beside the point. Those are where his instincts seem to lie, that he's someone who's not ashamed or doesn't think it's controversial to say that he is a unionist, that he wants Northern Ireland to remain within the union after years in which New Labour said that it was essentially neutral on the union. It was an honest broker, and that was it. It was not going beyond that role in its approach to Northern Irish affairs. And the Good Friday Agreement forces, obviously, the British government, technically the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to call a referendum on Irish unity if it appears likely to him, and it says him in the legislation, but it would be him or her, to result in a vote for Irish unity. And that gives the British government considerable room to interpret public opinion. And Republicans have tended to think that Labour would be more willing in that interpretation to err in its favour. And yet there is, I think, limited reason based on what has been said publicly to believe that that would be the case. Last month, there was a slightly curious story on BBC Northern Ireland where it reported that Labour had said it would set out the criteria which have to be met for calling a border poll. However, when you looked at what Labour's shadow Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Kyle actually said in that interview, he said, quote, "I am saying I am not going to be a barrier if the circumstances emerge," unquote, and that he would call a referendum if the circumstances necessary for that were met. That is to say, another way of essentially saying he isn't going to break the law. He will do what the Good Friday Agreement says if there is evidence that there would be a vote for Irish unity. He will not, as legally he should not, stand in the way of that border poll being called. Those comments were greeted with a degree of jubilation from some nationalists and a degree of dismay from many unionists, which I don't think matched the reality of what he actually said. And several days later, he clarified that he had, quote, only stated the law. So I think that in that, there is evidence of how a few words can be interpreted perhaps beyond what they actually mean. But I think that there is also a criticism here of Labour in terms of some of its language around these very delicate issues. Whereas Tony Blair and Mo Mowlam had clearly spent years working carefully on their policy towards Northern Ireland, and people like Jonathan Powell had been involved in that, there has been limited evidence of Labour putting that sort of detailed work into Northern Ireland, even though arguably Northern Ireland is now a hugely significant point of geopolitical argument and of significance to the UK, because it is now infecting its relations not just with the rest of Europe, but also with its key partner in the US, and that is a very significant aspect of this. And just finally, Labour's answers here have been pretty scant so far. They've tended to either say nothing about some of these issues or say things which sometimes are slightly garbled. But I think that while Labour remains a bit of an unknown quantity, there are constraints upon them by the realpolitik of Northern Ireland's situation here. They can't, for instance, in a way that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn would have wanted, simply move really decisively towards backing Irish unity. They can't, on the other hand, do something that would be wildly pro-union in a way which would be seen to be unfair, or in a way which would be damaging the Good Friday Agreement. That's still a really central plank of what Labour sees as its post-war achievements in British politics. But I think that when you look at one of the other possibilities here, that was that there would be a move towards calling a sudden border poll by a British government which was being irresponsible, a British government which, as Colm Eastwood said to me last year, he feared that maybe Boris Johnson would move to call a snap border poll to confirm support for the union, almost a reckless disregard for what might come out of that, but out of a belief that when it was put to the people, they would back the status quo, especially if there wasn't time to prepare for that. I don't think any of that is likely under Labour. There's going to be much more of a sense of more stability, a sense of caution, a sense of this being something which is treated very carefully. And even if that planning hasn't happened yet, I think it would put them off doing something precipitous like that. And so there'll be a very different dynamic here. But I think just finally, the reason why the border poll issue in some ways when it comes to Labour might be a bit of a red herring is that by getting rid of the most unpopular aspect of the union right now, that is unpopular Tory prime ministers, people like Boris Johnson, people like Liz Truss, regardless of what Starmer does, just by not being those people, I think there is significant reason to believe that the constitutionally apathetic voters in Northern Ireland on whom the union depends are more likely to suddenly see the union as being much more benign. And that will not simply be about style and about how he comes across. I think that will also, to a certain extent, be about substance. This will be about Labour moving moving UK policy closer to the European Union by going for higher alignment with EU rules, and particularly when it comes to something like a veterinary agreement, softening some of the harshest aspects of the Irish Sea border. That will not, in a stroke, get rid of these problems. The NI protocol, I think, will infect our politics for many years, if, as seems likely, it remains in some form, even if significantly renegotiated or altered in key areas. That is something which is going to be difficult. It's not going to be possible for a Labour Prime Minister to simply say, look, I'm a nice guy, I'm a moderate guy, I'm a dull guy, this is all going to be fine. It's too difficult for that. But I think that by removing some of the worst aspects of that, it will be a significant boost for the stability of the union. And just finally, I think that the stance of Sinn Féin in several years, potentially when they look back on this period, might be to wonder how they got this so badly wrong. They now have had something like 6.5 years of post-Brexit turmoil, at points outright chaos in British affairs. They've had very unpopular leaders, not just of the UK, but of NI unionism. And yet there has been a sense here in Northern Ireland that they are still saying, I think, in many of these areas, let's have the conversation. Let's start the conversation. Let's start planning for Irish unity. They've had 6.5 years and they're still talking about starting the conversation, bringing people into the conversation. Now, that's obviously where they have to start. That's a reasonable place in which to start, but to never get beyond there at a point where there has been this unprecedented opportunity for republicanism, for nationalism, I think is pretty unforgivable. It may be that circumstances change. It may be that actually Labour turns out to be disastrous. It may be that there are very deep problems that cannot be solved by a change of government. But I think that there are also significant reasons to believe that while the DUP ironically wanted three successive British prime ministers who turned out to be really deeply disastrous for its interests, this person who they don't want, who they are not as closely aligned to in any sense of the word, actually might turn out to be the person who helps to salvage something for them, which they say they cherish above all these other things that they have put in front of that ideal over recent years. Sorry for slightly exceeding my time there, I think.
Not at all, Sam. It was excellent to hear your remarks. And I'll just hand straight over to Professor Kenny.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks very much, Sam, for that really interesting set of reflections. I mean, one of the first things it makes me think is that we are at a time when there's going to be an increasing focus upon Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and what a Starmer administration might look like for obvious reasons, which you sketched. And obviously here we're talking about Northern Ireland and in general, but also the protocol. And we might also, this sort of shades into the question, the still unresolved question really about what sorts of policy approach to Brexit Labour is going to settle on. So all of those things I think are definitely there in the mix. And I tend to agree with you that as yet we're still sort of trying to divine exactly on some of these issues where Labour will go. But I just before I want to probe a little bit your core argument here, but just one thing I want to do first is just pick up a point you made briefly there, Sam. Just it's a sort of cautionary note, isn't it, about how things might look in 2 years' time. Let's say there's an election in 2 years' time. We don't know, but that seems the most likely outcome now. And things could look very different. And one of the really difficult, I think, things with British politics at the moment is the future is really quite open. Usually British politics is not like this. It's not in the short term. There are lots of different pathways you can see. You could see continual government instability, but we could have a more competent administration that survives and slowly eats into that extraordinary poll lead that Labour's got. And the dynamic and the mood might shift a little bit. And there's just it's a note of caution about trying to understand the future based on exactly where we are now, because what comes next will really matter, I think, for that future. And in particular, what kind of, were Labour to win the next election, the scale and the nature of its victory would be incredibly important, I think. So that's just a quick observation. Just before, I know we're going to talk about Starmer and Labour here, but I can't resist today, given the news we've had about the new Prime Minister, just opening by asking you, what's your sense of the approach the Sunak government might take to Northern Ireland, and particularly on the protocol? Do you see the potential for a change of direction or a continuation of the sort of warmer sort of mood music that came with the under the Truss administration?
I think we're likely to see a continuation and possibly an acceleration of that warming relationship between London and Brussels and Dublin. Really, it's a three-party relationship, if you like, these days on this issue. But I should preface that by saying that, rightly, as you say there is a limit to what we know about what Labour will do. There's also a limit to what we know about what will happen in 6 months' time, let alone 2 years' time. I think that is equally true of this Prime Minister, because when I was going back when he was standing for the leadership over the summer, the first time, and I was going back through what he had said in Parliament about Northern Ireland, there was very little to work off. He wrote a piece for the Belfast Telegraph, for the paper I write for, which was sounding quite tough in the protocol, but there was a sense where it was, I think, saying what I think he expected people wanted to hear at that point. I mean, he was trying to get elected as Tory leader, and that was being not countermanded, but that was being counterbalanced by what some people in the Tory party were saying to me about what he had been saying privately about the NI protocol bill, where he had been critical of it. He was instinctively, I think, wanting much better relations with the EU. That's quite logical for somebody who's Chancellor. He has got the Treasury officials in his ear. They're saying, look, we're in a grim position here economically. We don't want a trade war. All of those reasons mean that the Chancellor, I think, should be, all things being equal, more amenable to that argument than almost anybody else in government outside maybe the Foreign Secretary. So what does he actually do? I think it's as much about what he can do as about what he wants to do. Steve Baker was interviewed on Ridge and Sunday yesterday and was really robust in what he said about this, where he was backing Sunak. He was an early backer of Sunak, of it. Sunak. Well, actually, I think he came out yesterday, so actually not an early backer, but it was a 4-day campaign. But he came out to back him certainly long before Boris dropped out, and was quite vicious about Boris. So it was clear that he was not in any way coming on board because simply of those issues which push people like Nadeem Zahawi over late last night, quite embarrassingly. But I mean, there was a sense here where he was being explicit in saying the ERG will topple the government if they change policy on the protocol bill. Now, that's an extraordinary thing to say publicly by somebody who is backing this individual to be candidate for the top job. And so therefore, while on paper there is a significant Tory, a very significant Tory majority still in the Commons, in practice there's not. And so the ERG easily, if they are able to coherently move as a bloc, and they may not be able to do that because they were split on this question of who to back, but if they do maintain that unity on the protocol bill, that is a significant factor. I think also, if you're the EU, why would you cut a deal? One argument goes, with this guy, if you know that in a couple of years' time, at most, and quite possibly less than that, the Labour Party will do a veterinary deal with you, they'll do other deals with you. But I think that has to be seen in the context of, if there was a good deal for the EU, I think they would want to just get this off their plate right now. It's an irritant. There are big issues in the world in all sorts of areas, economically and in terms of war, etc. And everybody, I think, wants to get rid of this if they can. The problem is, as we know, that they can't, because it is incredibly complicated.
And if there was, just one more question before I get to Starmer, we'll get there, but if there was a deal that emerged in the coming months or year, what impact would that have on the unionist parties in Northern Ireland? How do you think they would respond to that?
So it's a fascinating question, because this is the career-defining choice for Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. The point at which there is a deal, as I think is overwhelmingly likely to come, whether it's under Labour, whether it's under the Tories, I think it would have come under Truss. I think it will come under Sunak, perhaps. If not, it will come under Labour. Even if there is not a deal at this point and they push ahead with the protocol bill and they unilaterally disregard parts of this, it's not a long-term solution to this. It's not resolving the issue. And so therefore, at some point, there's going to be a deal. And at some point, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, or whoever is leader of the DUP, is going to have to decide, do we present this as a victory, or at least something we can grudgingly accept and go back into government? Or do we accept that we're out of government for a decade or more, and that there simply isn't devolved government in Belfast for that period? That is the scale of the choice that confronts him. I think that instinctively Sir Geoffrey would like to go back into government tomorrow. That's my instinct. That might be wrong, but that's my reading of him. It's what other people in the DUP have said to me. But he can't right now, because he is a prisoner to the popularity of what he did in walking out of Stormont. Stormont is this incredibly unpopular form of government. It is a victim in some ways of its own shambolic form of doing government. There are consequences to that. They don't necessarily catch up with you immediately, but they're catching up with the wider system of government now. And so while Sinn Féin walking out of government was the most popular thing they had done in years, when the DUP did it, they found it was the most popular thing they'd done in years, and it's very hard to get back in. It was 3 years last time. Who knows what it will be now? But the really surprising thing is that in the last polling on this, which is now something like 2 months out of date, but still it was after a period of rampant inflation. The winter was coming closer. There were just stories every day in the media about how bad things were and how much worse they were going to get. And rather than support within unionism going down for Sir Geoffrey Donaldson's stance, it was still going up. It was climbing. So it will start to go down as the winter bites, as people start to see how bad things get, but it's coming down from a very, very high level. So we're in a genuinely bad place. I think some people look at this and think it's all performative, and the DUP, which, you know, I've been hugely critical of. They've been disastrous over recent years. But I think that on this, even if you were Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and you wanted to go back in, the reality is that quite simply he can't do it. He would be overthrown within hours if he was to do so.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's just jump to the main focus here. So Labour and Starmer and how that might play out. So I thought a lot of the points you made, you know, really ring true, Sam, and I thought there was a lot of sense there. I suppose for me, there's just a but here about how, you know, whether this is the whole picture or whether actually there are some quite important sort of countervailing points that might pull Labour or maybe pull unionist politicians in Northern Ireland in a more suspicious, wary direction of a Labour government. So let me just explore a few of those with you. The first one is I guess a historical one. You know, as you know well, and you mentioned, you know, Roy Mason, Peter Mandelson, that it's true that there have been many moments when Labour has disappointed Irish nationalists, but there have also equally been moments when Labour has been very disappointing for unionists and for loyalists. And I just wonder particularly about the Blair period, because it seems to me that period and the achievement of the Good Friday Agreement is really, you know, it runs very deeply in Labour's psyche now, even though, you know, most Labour MPs were not around when they were not in Parliament when that happened. But that's kind of very deeply in the Labour mindset as this was an achievement. And the sort of understanding of that is that it was the reason that worked was because the Blair government and Blair himself were prepared to put a lot of work in to achieving a sort of bipartisan position, to working closely with Dublin, as you mentioned. I mean, that was obviously crucially important, and to sort of continually trying to step away from the sort of, you know, to negotiate between the interests of the different parties. Now that there's a sort of strong memory of that in Labour, and it seems to me that instinct of that's how you handle Northern Ireland still runs, I suspect, in the current leadership, not least because Blair himself is I suspect, still talking to Starmer and his allies about Northern Ireland, as others will be. But also, I wonder if, on the other hand, the sort of political reaction to that in the British Tory party, which particularly became apparent under the coalition, and particularly you know, David Cameron and some of his advisors were sort of saying, well, we need to push back towards in a more avowedly unionist direction, and that Labour's gone too far in trying to take that sort of let's stand away from the different parties' view. Do you think that it's that reaction that will be in the mind of unionist politicians were there to be a Labour government? Would there be a suspicion of where Labour's likely to go in the way in which it deals with different parties?
Yes, there will, but I should say that there is a suspicion in unionism of almost anything and anyone. There was a suspicion of British politicians in 1921 and in the years before partition, and there has been a latent sense of siege and suspicion ever since, and it goes way back, even prior to the 20th century. But I think that yes, you're absolutely right to say that. I mean, there is no way that you could characterize Keir Starmer as simply some sort of union flag waving unionist who is going to give unionism what it wants, etc. I'm I suppose being slightly provocative in some of what I've said there, but I think that yes, the instinctive position of lots of people in Labour is to tend towards an affinity with Irish nationalism. Some of that is about history, some of that is about economics, some of that is about their view of the EU now, where they have a common position in many ways. But I think that Starmer's position, and of course Starmer could become Prime Minister and be overthrown in a scandal in 2 years, and suddenly someone else becomes Labour leader with a big majority. All sorts of things can change very quickly, and I suppose I'm being critical of Sinn Féin for not anticipating some of the changes that have come and almost assumed that this straight line that seemed to be going on where the union was going down would just continue with an inevitable descent regardless of what happened. But actually, likewise, you could say that I'm perhaps oversimplifying that. I think that on the question of Dublin's involvement, lots of unionists instinctively hate the involvement of Dublin in any aspect of Northern Irish affairs. That was formalised in the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, but actually when you go back in the history of this, I mean, really from the early 70s and maybe the late 60s, you've got a clear acceptance in Whitehall, in the British government, at the cabinet table, that Dublin has some role in articulating the views of Irish nationalists in the north. So that's formalised in a way that unionism doesn't like in 1985, but actually really it's been there for a lot longer. It's not going away. There is a pragmatic acceptance of it within the DUP, if not among their supporters in every case. And so therefore, I think that is less significant than, for instance, a sense that this is a prime minister who potentially would move towards joint authority or something of that nature. That's been talked about in recent days. Sinn Féin have thrown that out as an idea. Doug Beattie of the Ulster Unionist Party has thrown that out as an idea. Both of them, I would say, have a vested interest from opposite ends of the spectrum in saying, you know, the DUP are screwing this up to an extent that either here's a big stick that we're going to beat you with to go back in from Sinn Féin's perspective, or from Doug Beattie's perspective, these people are so stupid that they're giving away something that we cherish. But actually, joint authority, I don't think at any point has been a credible threat. It was used by the lady in Paisley as a justification for going into government with Martin McGuinness, but it always had a great dollop of him seeking to try to cover up, I suppose, his embarrassment at what he had done, and the sort of smallness, I suppose, of the fig leaf that was hiding his embarrassment at that point. So if it was easy for that to happen, it would have happened in the 3 years, I suppose, where Stormont was down, even if not in an official way, in a sort of unofficial way. In reality, I think while the British government is paying the checks here, and they're very large, I just don't see any realistic prospect, even aside from the instability it would cause in Northern Ireland, of them allowing the Irish government to decide how that money is spent, or even in other non-financial areas of policy. I just don't think that's realistic. So outside of that, it's more a continuation of what has been British government policy for half a century.
And then a different sort of question then about, which I suppose probably reflects sitting in an English context, looking at some of these themes about the kind of figure that Starmer is. And I think, you know, a lot of what you said rings true. You know, he's certainly emphasized patriotism, a certain kind of Britishness. I too was struck by the things he said about the monarchy and the late monarch. And I think from, you know, that clearly there are a lot of good, strong political reasons behind him wishing to sort of give emphasis to those aspects of his own outlook. I'm sure it's, you know, these are the views he generally holds, but he's clearly choosing to make that sort of stuff salient. Now, a lot of that is clearly in the context of thinking about English voters in particular, and the desire to win back some of those seats that go under that heading, the red wall. But I think more generally, it's also a very important part of Starmer's story, which is to say, I'm not like the last guy, and both I'm different, but also the party has changed fundamentally. And patriotism is a very good cue. It's a very nice signal, which cuts through to voters, I think, to say that. The thing about that is, I think I want to sort of slightly separate that from the question of what would be his or Labour's policy to the union, because whilst you're right, there's a small c conservatism there, perhaps, it doesn't necessarily follow that spills over into a small c conservatism in terms of policy choices about a whole range of different questions affecting the devolution and the position of not just Northern Ireland, but also Wales, Scotland, and indeed England. And I think here, it's worth noting that again, we're not sure. There hasn't been a lot of detailed policy work, but on some of these issues, we know that Gordon Brown has been asked to develop some policy thinking. Some of the details of that thinking were leaked recently. I don't think Northern Ireland was included in that, which was interesting. But very much that was a push towards further reform, quite a radical push actually, to think about moving in a more devolved, more federal direction, including with some quite interesting proposals about devolution in England. Now, I think it's important to stress that there are these. I'm not saying that Starmer will necessarily go in that direction. I think at the moment it looks unlikely to me that he's the kind of leader who would leap in those directions. But there are some countervailing pressures on him to be more reformist, and there's a lot of popularity for some of those arguments. Now, I think the really interesting question is, how does that spill over in the context of Northern Ireland? I mean, will he be, a safety first, let's protect the union at all costs Prime Minister, or will he be take up what is quite a natural Labour position of saying we will be the party that moves the union forward, that evolves the union and tries to sort of put it on a more stable footing. So I'd slightly query the idea that just because he talks about patriotism and the institutions of Britain and the British state, it necessarily means his party won't be wanting to change some aspects of that. I think there are a whole bunch of questions around reform, not just there, that Labour might want to think about in constitutional terms. Obviously, where does Northern Ireland sit with that is always, I think, the important question. But the other one I wanted to put to you directly is just to say, in terms of those issues about how Stormont functions and the post-1998 agreement, the power sharing arrangements, which effectively hand a veto to the largest unionist and nationalist parties. There's been quite a lot of talk about reforming the rules whereby the executive is formed and maybe developing a higher penalty for parties that walk out of the executive. Could you see Labour lining up behind that sort of agenda and pursuing it when it was in office?
It's a very interesting question, and I suppose it would be a lot easier for them, and they'd be much more inclined to do that if somebody like Tony Blair and Jonathan Powell were to come in behind it, Peter Mandelson, people of that caliber who were very heavily involved at that point. I think that we've moved to a position in Northern Ireland where the principles of the Good Friday Agreement are almost uncontroversial. Even Jim Allister, at the hardest edge of hardline unionism, is accepting of the idea that there must be power sharing. So even the most Paisleyite of current unionist current unionist political leaders is not going back to the sort of unionism of the 1960s or 70s or even 80s. But at the same time, there is an acceptance across most of those who support the agreement that it's not working. And so I think where it gets very difficult is to move beyond an acceptance that it's broken. It's a bit like the protocol. The protocol clearly isn't working. It's clearly hugely problematic. But how on earth do you fix it? That's where everybody starts to disagree. And so the simpler ways, and something which I've written in the past, I think would be a very sensible idea, would be to remove the single veto, which allows the biggest party to block everybody else governing. So it's one thing to allow everybody to be offered a place in government. It's quite another thing to say that if they don't take up those places, then nobody else can govern. So you've got this party with a very small percentage of our support base in or the NI electorate are holding up everything for everyone, because in a very splintered political landscape, you've got the DUP at their zenith. We're getting something like 34% of the vote, I think, from memory. So it's not like a two-party system where that is even as substantive as Labour or the Tories would be. But even though I think that would improve things, so right now it would mean we could have an executive, we could have an assembly. It would not solve things on its own. And this is where it gets really tricky, because the Good Friday Agreement is this structure of veto upon veto upon veto. And if you want to gum up this system, you have got all of this in your armory if you want to do it. So it would stop the DUP from simply pushing a button that says no executive. but it would allow them to stop the executive functioning in a way that would mean it would collapse. So it's almost going back to the way in which the, albeit in very different circumstances, but the Sunningdale deal fell apart. The executive got off the ground, and I know that it was to do with street protests, it was to do with paramilitary behavior, all of that, but it was hamstrung through other factors. This would be within the system. You couldn't get your budget through the House without the support of the largest unionist or nationalist party if they weren't in the executive, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that would have to be rewritten. And so therefore we I suppose, come back to the question, what is the Good Friday Agreement and how much of it can we ditch while still saying that we support the Good Friday Agreement?
Okay, thanks, Sam. Just one final question from me, and I'm going to hand back to Barry. And it's to step right back from these sort of considerations about Starmer and Sunak and so on. I'm just really curious, over the course of your career as a journalist, do you think that the way in which British politicians feel and think about Northern Ireland, I don't mean in terms of necessarily public statements, but just the sort of, your sense of their innermost thoughts about it, do you think that's shifted? Do you think British politicians care as much about Northern Ireland now as they used to, or has that changed in any way?
That's a very good question again, and I'm not sure is the honest answer. I think that ostensibly, if you look at the way in which Northern Ireland was the way in which it was on the political radar at the start of my career 16 odd years ago, it was arguably less significant than it is now, in the sense that it is at the heart of this big geopolitical issue, and certainly wasn't in that position back then, but it had come out of a period where it was more significant to what went on in Downing Street and in the Treasury than I think it has been over that period. I think that there arguably has been more of an education almost of British politicians and civil servants over the last year since Brexit of how complicated Northern Ireland is, and the sort of simple realizing, or the simple belief that I think a lot of these people had, that it was largely solved, that the agreement had, not completely got rid of all these problems, but it was on the path to all of these things being dealt with, was far too simplistic, and that actually there were these massive difficulties that they didn't even understand, let alone have the means of addressing. And I was struck by something in the UK and the Changing Europe Brexit Witness Archive, and I've now forgotten who I think it was a senior civil servant had said, but there was a really interesting interview there where he said that within Whitehall, the sort of things that really got civil servants excited were things like the rise of China, the big geopolitical issues about energy security, etc. All of those obviously are massively important. But he said they actually knew less about what was going on within a part of their own country. Now, he was talking about that largely in relation to, I think, the north of England, in relation to areas that voted for Brexit, but it was also true in relation to Northern Ireland. And I think that's one of the belated realizations to come out of this issue, that this is a massive irritant, if you like, in British politics, as it has been for centuries. First the island of Ireland, now Northern Ireland, and in many cases these people have got a pretty limited understanding of the reasons why that's the case, and yet they're making the decisions about how that can be resolved.
Thank you, Sam. At this point, I'm going to hand over to you, Barry.
Thanks so much. As ever with these meetings, I'd love nothing more than to continue to listen to you talking, but we are against the clock. So what I'm going to propose doing, I'm going to hand over to my co-convener, Professor Niamh Gallagher, who may have a question or two for you, Sam. I'm then going to synthesize the questions we have from the attendees. They're broadly under three headings: society in Northern Ireland, the politics of these islands, and the constitutional nature of these islands. So I'm going to do that for a couple of minutes and hand you over to Niamh.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll rattle through these, Sam, just picking you up on a couple of things that you've said. I've got two questions for you, broadly in the space of politics, and one that's more historical. You talked about a border poll, and we know that in the Good Friday Agreement it's quite vague about whatever those circumstances are that seem to necessitate calling a border poll. And I wonder, can you build some structure into that for us? What do you think the conditions would be to necessitate the calling of a border poll?
I don't think we've got long enough for me to do that. But what I would recommend is for people to read the UCL report on that if they haven't already done so. The working group, which quite possibly some of the people here were working on, which is excellent, I think, at getting into the complexity of that and things like not just the culling of the border poll, but things like the very complex differences between campaign finance laws on both sides of the Irish border. I mean, really, once you start looking at this, it's a bit like Brexit. You start to realize this is 1,000 times more complicated than I thought, even if I thought it was complicated to start with. But I mean, at its most basic, I think if there is consistent polling evidence, if there is a surging support for Irish nationalist parties, now that's not as simple as it once was, because we know that a swathe of people who vote for Alliance, for instance, will be unionist in the sense that they will be pro-union, if not culturally unionist, and likewise will be pro-nationalist in the sense of the constitutional question, even if they don't say that is how they call themselves, or that's how they describe their stance, I suppose, on this issue. But in crude terms, they're in one camp or the other, but it's hard to define that. So I think that polling is the best that we have. It's imperfect, but that's, as you know, very complicated because different methodologies, different results. And the honest answer is that none of us really know which of those methodologies is most accurate. We can guess, we can work it out. My best guess is that it's somewhere between the two, but yeah, who knows?
Yep, great. And we've any amount of evidence of polling in the recent past getting things wrong. So it doesn't really bode well for such an important question to rely on that one metric, right? Okay, great. So the second thing you mentioned, and I just wanted to ask you a bit more about this, is you said Stormont is an incredibly unpopular form of government in Northern Ireland, if I'm correct. And so I wanted just to ask you a bit more about that. I mean, it's all Northern Ireland has. So if it's not that, what's the alternative?
People are asking me very good questions, and I'm more comfortable asking questions as a journalist than necessarily answering them. But I mean, I think that both anecdotally and in terms of the polling on this, people can be quite contradictory, I suppose, in what they think. All of us are contradictory in some of the things that we believe. People support a political party but completely disagree maybe with one of the core elements of its platform. And so I think that there is broad and very substantial support, for instance, for the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Stormont is the most tangible and the most substantive aspect of the institutions that flow from that agreement. So there is a certain logic to saying that in an implicit way, in a de facto way, that means that the public supports Stormont. So I think the public support the idea of devolution. They support the idea of local people having more control over their lives. I think they like the idea of being able to lobby their politicians and vote their politicians out of office, etc. But there is a really widespread belief that Stormont hasn't worked. I think that empirically it hasn't worked. I mean, I think it would be very hard to construct an argument that said that somehow it really had been a great success in governing Northern Ireland. And so whether you look at NAMA, whether you look at the RHI scandal, whether you look at the Red Sky scandal, I mean, there are enough scandals to basically fill the alphabet. And so that perception that Stormont has failed to deliver good government and that it hasn't been able to do the basics of, for instance, dealing with the health problems that are now bedeviling our people here, that is a situation which would be intolerable anywhere else in the rest of the UK. I mean, as a journalist, I look at the BBC sometimes, I look at some of the Fleet Street newspapers, and I just think, I mean, they are speaking about waiting times in England and how completely intolerable they are, and they don't realise that those have been the waiting times in Northern Ireland for years. I talked to a doctor about 3 years ago who said that the waiting time in parts of Northern Ireland to get a hip replacement is 10 years. Now think about that in terms of the agony that somebody goes through with their need for that. Stormont has seen those problems get worse, not get better, and that means that when people say to the DUP, look, get back in, people's livelihoods are at risk here, people's lives are at risk here, people are suffering here, all of that's true. But the public, I think, just don't believe that if they got back in, it would make much difference. I happen to think that as a journalist, obviously it would make some difference, because we know, looking at it clearly, that there are some decisions that can be taken by ministers, that can't be taken by civil servants. But there's a really dangerous, I think, disconnect between the public and Stormont there. And frankly, the political parties, particularly the DUP and Sinn Féin, and to a certain extent the government, by not being more of a watchdog over them, have been fully responsible for that. They are the people who have, with gay abandon, really wrecked a lot of those institutions, and now they are suffering the consequences of that. And we all are, as members of the public here.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that, Sam. I'd love to expand on it, but I can't expand on that one anymore due to time. I want to put my history hat on and ask you a historical question, if I may. So I know many of our attendees today will be less familiar with the ins and outs of Northern Ireland and its history than maybe some of us here on the panel. So 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, when the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant was formed, or rather signed, there were several reasons, and strong reasons, as to why Unionist Ulster, as defined at that time, 9 counties, 6 counties, 4 counties, whatever it was going to be, did not want to submit to a Home Rule Ireland. There were religious arguments, there were imperial arguments, there were arguments around citizenship, there was a gender dimension to it. All of those were there. Now, most of those have gone, insofar as the empire is no longer there. The republic's quite a secular state. Economically, it's doing very well. It's had a, jumped from the 19th to the 21st century, I think Fintan O'Toole called it, in terms of its sort of views towards morality and gender and many other things. So could you maybe spell out for us a bit why Unionists in Northern Ireland are still so scared by the prospect of a united Ireland, given that so many of those concrete historical reasons that existed 100 years ago are no longer there?
No small questions here, Sam, as you've noted.
Thank you. So I interviewed recently Wallace Thompson. I say recently, it was possibly months ago, because time goes by quite quickly, but it was I think it was earlier this year, and he was a founding member of the DUP. He was a real Paisleyite of the Paisleyites, somebody who agreed with Paisley not only politically but theologically, a very conservative evangelical Protestant, very fundamentalist. He was a former special advisor to Nigel Dodds in Stormont when he was finance minister, etc., and who is still a member of the DUP. And I don't have his words in front of me, but my recollection of them were something like, when we look back 100 years, almost everything that our forefathers were fighting for has gone, which is basically what you've said there. And it's just clearly factually correct in terms of the reasons given then are very different to the reasons that people give for unionism these days. And I mean, when people like Arlene Foster talk about why Northern Ireland should stay in the Union, they tend to include things like we watch the same football matches, which is, clearly a preposterous position to be arguing that has any relevance to your constitutional preference. And there are lots of people who are thoroughly Irish and thoroughly Irish Republican who follow Manchester United or whatever. But there has been, I think, a failure of unionism to update, if you like, its ideology as to why they believe in the union, as to why they want the union to endure. A lot of it is about simply the comfort of the status quo, the fact that what people grow up with, if they're fundamentally happy with it, they want to maintain. And I think that's true of some people in the south of Ireland as well, that while they might want Irish unity at some future point, if their society is largely working for them, and we know it's not working for some people, but for the people for whom it is working, they don't necessarily want the uncertainty of throwing that all up in the air if these, wild Northerners might come in and mess everything up and change the anthem and change the flag and change all the stuff that they think kind of works. So there is a sort of natural, I suppose, human inclination if you think that it's kind of working, that you're happy with it. But I think that there is a deeper truth, I think, to how both nationalism and unionism look at these questions. I think that at a deeper atavistic level, there is a not wholly irrational, but often unconscious or subconscious fear of the other side. And it's not that people who feel this walk around Belfast or Newry or Derry or wherever, looking at other people and worrying that they're going to be attacked or anything of that nature. But I think that if they have any knowledge of Irish history and Irish history, as we know, tends to be something, I think it was A.T.Q. Stewart said that the Irish knew their history very well, but it tends to be a history that is a folk history. And so both sides have got something that is founded in a degree of fact. Lots of it is very factual, but it's one-sided, so it doesn't tell the other aspect of what might have happened 300 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever. And so therefore, I think there is this sense that when you look at Irish history and Northern Irish history in particular, that it is something where there are these cycles of violence. We hope that those are over. We hope that that will never come back. But there is, I think, a rational fear that that might come back at some future point, and that if this goes wrong, that people get killed, and that one tribe is at the throats of the other tribe. And to a certain extent, that is what happened during the Troubles. To a certain extent, that is what happened at the time of partition. You can go way back to 1641 and to all sorts of points in between. I think that it's very difficult to address that when it's not something that a lot of people even consciously are aware of. But at some deep level, there is this fear, which we see expressed in things like peace lines in Belfast, where I am now, that if they don't take certain precautions, they might just be massacred, or they might just have their home burnt or whatever. That's not necessarily always correct. It might be completely wrong. But I think that that actually explains and is never really articulated by unionist leaders. It's not what they say. And maybe I'm wrong when I say that that's what I think it is. But I think that there is this very deep and quite primeval fear of what happens if this goes badly wrong. And just finally, I would say on that, and sorry that I'm giving a very long answer to a very short question, but I think that Brexit both brings Irish unity closer in that it destabilises what was a very stable situation for the Union, but it also makes it much harder because of that fear. So people have seen what happened with Brexit, where they were given these grand promises, everything will be fine, everything will be great, you don't need to listen to these doom mongers about how bad it's going to be, and they saw that actually it was very bad indeed. Now, there'll be a much more coherent plan for Irish unity, a much more thought through plan than there was for Brexit. I think that's pretty clear, but I think that that fear that as bad as it was in England, and it was really bad obviously in terms of the social divisions, the political divisions, the family divisions, in some cases nobody thought that people were going to set off bombs in the middle of London if it went wrong or if it went against their side. In Northern Ireland, I think that would be the default position if it went badly wrong. If it didn't, if it was 60-40 or something of that nature, hopefully that would not be what would happen. But if it was contested, if there were allegations of vote rigging, if there were allegations that somehow this wasn't a legitimate outcome, that's the expectation of what would happen. And I think that frightens a lot of people, even who are in the centre ground, who might actually like Irish unity at some point, but they want to have a significant, overwhelming number of people on their side before it gets to that point.
Thank you, Sam. Over to Barry.
Thanks a million, Sam. Thank you, Niamh. Thank you, Mike. So look, we're running over a little bit. So those in attendance, please do feel to drop off if you need. But this discussion has been really rich, and I just want to try and take a couple more minutes, if I may. So the purpose of our series, Sam, Mike, everybody, is to allow for a space for frank discussion about the island of Ireland and its peoples and its politics. And I think you've really contributed to that enterprise. So thank you, Sam. Of course, you're not a politician, and we do often have politicians on, but just to say, like, you can't be held accountable in the same way. So thank you so much for your frank and clear remarks and for your honesty. So I'm going to put a couple of questions to you. Answer them as quickly as you wish, or shrug them off if you want. And then I want to give Mike a chance at the end, just 60 seconds to come back on anything you've said. From Brian Donaldson asks, can you ask Sam if he believes Rishi will pull out of an election in Northern Ireland to try and allow space for negotiations with the EU?
I've no idea.
On the constitutional nature of these islands, there are two questions. I'll put them to you real quick. First, from Andrew Gallagher, and this kind of speaks to something you said actually during your interventions. Do you think that Scottish independence, Sam, will be less likely under a Labour government? And what knock-on effect would that have on Northern Ireland's constitutional position? And relatedly, briefly, and also shrug off any of these questions, as I said, Richard Rogers asks, if the UK ever rejoined the EU, how would that affect Northern Irish politics? Give you a sense of what people are thinking about.
So on Andrew's question about Scotland, I think with the huge caveat that all sorts of things can change, I think there's good reason to believe that yes, the most likely outcome is that Scottish independence, the backing for Scottish independence recedes under Labour, that Labour win some seats in Scotland, some quite significant seats in Scotland, that they eat into the SNP. I think that there are actually fairly significant parallels between what's going on in the Tory party in one sense and what's going on within the SNP. They're doing it in different ways. The SNP aren't doing it to the extent that the Tories are doing it, or to the dramatic or in the very dramatic way that is happening in London. But both these parties have been in power, I think it would seem to many people, for just too long. They're now clapped out. They're out of ideas. They're starting to fight each other. Their flaws are starting to emerge quite publicly, and I think that is a natural part of the democratic cycle. It happens everywhere, and in every occasion, almost, people think that they will be the exceptions to this. That there are particular reasons why it won't happen in their circumstance. It will happen, and whether it happens now or not, I'm not sure. But I think that we're likely to see that sort of decline at least set in significantly. And if Labour are moving towards a landslide, and as Michael said earlier, there's significant reasons why that might not ultimately be the case. Things can change very dramatically. History is not a straight line, but that is, I think, likely based on what we now know, and on what would happen if the UK was to rejoin the EU. Again, I think it would make it much harder for Irish nationalism, because one of the core planks of their argument to people in the centre ground who are undecided on this, and who are central to whether Irish unity will ever happen, is get back your EU citizenship within in a full sense. I mean, obviously that's partially something which people can have through Irish citizenship, but in terms of the full benefits of being in the EU, that would certainly not be there. I think that the final thing to say in that, which is related to the protocol discussions, is that while I think unionism has very legitimate arguments against the protocol in terms of just it's clearly not working. I think lots of the people who said that it should be implemented rigorously are now moving back from that, because they didn't really realise what it entailed and how sweeping it was and how bureaucratic it was, etc. But there's also a counter argument to unionism, which says that if it does work, if you can genuinely get the best of both worlds, which isn't available right now, but which might be available after a different sort of protocol is put in place, then that actually secures the union. Because why would somebody in Northern Ireland who's wavering about this, who's undecided about this, why would they tear up the status quo, which is giving them something that they wouldn't get in a single all-island state, where they would have access to one market, yes, but they would lose their simple access to the other market on the island of GB. So there's all sorts of things that could happen here. But I think that yes, either moving closer to the EU or going right back in is ultimately going to be good for unionism. And yes, that's very ironic given the stance that the unionist parties are taking, certainly the big unionist party.
Just a point of clarity, Sam, in the extent to which the Northern Ireland Protocol isn't working in your view, is it because of the mechanics of the protocol, or because of unionist opposition to it?
It's principally about what the protocol does. I think it just isn't working in business terms, in terms of it has not been applied, and already we've got businesses coming out saying, I mean, that there was somebody two days ago saying they're just stopping doing the paperwork, sort of almost a rebellion against it in those terms, even though it's been simplified enormously for them. Lots of it is simply being disregarded by the British government, and the EU has kind of turned a blind eye to lots of that. So if it was fully implemented, it would be completely unworkable. Actually, I think if Boris Johnson had been clever, albeit it would have been difficult for him to do this without exposing that he was a liar on this issue, he would simply have said on day one, forget grace periods, forget phasing this in, forget British government support for businesses, etc. Let's just have the whole full fat protocol. And I mean, I talked to a major businessman in County Down about this recently, and he said, look, on day one it would have come in, there would have been no day two. Things would not have moved into Northern Ireland. They simply couldn't have done it based on what the protocol said. So I think that there was really bad negotiating by the British government by not realising the extent of this. I assume if you're not taking a more Machiavellian approach to this and thinking that they deliberately allowed it to be so bad because they knew it could never really work, And I think in parallel with that, there was a lack of comprehension from the EU side of how unionism in Northern Ireland related to the British government. I've talked to EU diplomats, to people in quite significant positions on the EU side who essentially couldn't understand early after the Irish Sea border went up why unionism was so irate about this, because they said, look, your government negotiated this, take it up with them. And I was trying to say to them, well, look, that really doesn't understand the very long history of unionist distrust with British governments, and of this particular British Prime Minister who obviously had betrayed unionism. But even without that aspect, there was a great deal, I think, of it being viewed from Brussels as, look, we don't negotiate, understandably in many ways, we don't negotiate with this tiny regional party in this tiny part of what is no longer going to be even a member state. We're a big, powerful international organization. We negotiate with national governments, and it's up to them to sort this out within their territory. You can understand why they thought that, but I think that has been shown to be a problematic way of looking at this. Now they are talking to those parties in Northern Ireland. They are trying to increase their presence here. Of course, the British government didn't make it easy for them in terms of, after the protocol was negotiated, stopping them having an office in Belfast, etc., etc. But I think the fundamental problem here is that, yes, this document, even with the best will in the world from unionism, simply couldn't have worked. It was always going to be recast in some way. It was about whether that was in terms that unionism was, I suppose, less dogmatic about it by collapsing Stormont, or trying to actually go along in a more consensual way.
Thanks a million, Sam. There are other questions. I'm going to share them with you by email, as we always do, and it'd be lovely to spend more time. But what I'm going to do is hand over to Mike for a minute, just to give your final kind of thoughts, Mike, and then I'll do the little bits of housekeeping and wrap up. But thank you, everyone, for your patience and time.
Thanks, Barry. Well, fatally, I've got two thoughts in my head that I'm going to share, so I'm going to try and get both of them into a minute. I think the first point I'd make, and we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I would give it more emphasis, is about the economy and about the position that the UK economy is in, and perhaps the even more dire position that we're about to experience. And we may have a more competent, sort of sober government in the shape of Sunak administration, but there are some massively difficult challenges ahead. And I think the way in which that impacts in Northern Ireland has been sort of underpriced, actually, in most of the sort of political analysis I've seen about the future that may unfold. And I'm thinking particularly about that group that you mentioned, Sam. I think you gave a good account of why most unionists are unlikely to change their sort of constitutional preference, but that group of the constitutionally indifferent, which is, I guess, about 20% of people, whether for many of those this might move the dial. The experience of several years of serious economic downturn in the UK in comparison with the Republic, might that change the game in terms of those figures about people's overall levels of support for the two different constitutional options? It's one thing. The other thing is, I just wanted to pick up the point Sam made about good government in Northern Ireland now. I think this is a massively important question, which has been, on the British side, has been occluded by the focus on the protocol and Brexit and all of that. That there is a real problem here. It's partly obviously about politics and the fact that we haven't got a functioning executive. It's also perhaps about institutional design, some of the things you talked about there, Sam, but also, as you mentioned, it's also about service provision. I mean, there are some terrible outcomes in Northern Ireland in comparison with other parts of the UK. And, ultimately, those are issues that the UK government and British politicians should be caring deeply about, as well as Northern Ireland's own politicians. We're about to go into this period after the 28th of October, in which the caretaker ministers that are in place, presumably if there isn't a deal, nothing that you've said leads me to think you think that anything is imminent. So we're going to no longer have even caretaker management. So the Northern Ireland Civil Service will be managing what is an incredibly difficult situation with a huge budgetary problem that's already emerged. So things are going to get worse before they get better. And I do think that question of what does good government in Northern Ireland in the short to medium term, whilst we're in this situation, what does that look like? And who are the stakeholders in terms of trying to improve things? I think that's a massively important and somewhat neglected question.
Thanks very much, Mike. At that point, it's just my pleasure to draw this to a close. It's been a really interesting and very enjoyable and I think important discussion. So thanks, Sam, again, for your candor, for your honesty. Please follow us on Twitter, sign up for our mailing list. It's in the chat. And indeed, please send us ideas, feedback, questions, suggestions. I have two other bits to do before signing off. Thank you very much to Iona Clark, a research assistant, and indeed Niamh Gallagher for pulling this event together. Final item, on the 14th of November, we're absolutely delighted to be hosting our first in-person version of this Cambridge series in the future of the island of Ireland. This was born at the peak of the pandemic in back in those days in 2020, and we're delighted now to be hosted at St. Cat's College on the 14th of November for a special event on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Special guests will include Andrew McCormick and others, who's an outspoken and very kind of vivid and important contributor to that debate. So please keep an eye out on our mailing list, on our Twitter and elsewhere for details, because there will be a limited number of in-person spaces available for you, our audience. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for giving us 16 extra minutes than what we asked for, and have a good evening.